My name is Cassandra Elliot. Cassie. I'm 28 years old, and I own a business that my father once called, and I'm quoting directly here, a glorified garage sale. He said it at dinner. Easter Sunday, 14 months ago. My aunt had just asked me how things were going. Genuine curiosity in her voice. And before I could even finish my sentence, before I could get to the part where I mentioned that I'd just crossed 6 figures in annual revenue for the first time, my dad, Richard Elliot, let out this short little laugh. The kind that isn't really a laugh. The kind that's a verdict dressed up as a chuckle. Cassie sells old stuff online, he told my aunt, cutting into his ham like the conversation was already over. It's like a glorified garage sale. Cute little thing she's got going. Cute! I was 27 years old. I had a business license, a registered LLC, a storage facility, 2 part-time contractors, and a client list that included 3 interior design firms in Chicago. But sure, cute. I didn't say any of that. I picked up my glass of water, took a slow sip, and smiled at my aunt like everything was fine. Because here's the thing about growing up with Richard Elliot as your father. You learn early that correcting him in public only ever makes things worse. He doesn't back down, he doubles down. And suddenly you're the one who ruined Easter. So I smiled. And I stored it. Before I tell you what happened over the next 14 months, I need you to understand something about my dad that took me years to fully see. He is charming. Genuinely, effortlessly charming. The kind of man who walks into a room and immediately becomes the center of it. He has this big laugh and this firm handshake, and this way of making you feel like you're the most interesting person he's ever talked to. Right up until the moment you become inconvenient or threatening. And then something shifts. Something cold comes into his eyes and the warmth just evaporates. He was like that with my mom for years before she finally left. Not violent, not cruel in any way you could point to clearly. Just diminishing. Quietly, consistently, with total plausible deniability. She left when I was 19. I don't blame her. I only wish I'd understood sooner what I was watching. My dad kept the house. A 4-bedroom in Deerfield, Illinois. Beautiful neighborhood, older home, good bones. He'd been in it for 22 years, and always talked about it like it was his crowning achievement. I built a life in that house, he used to say, which is a funny way to take credit for a building you just happened to occupy. I started my business at 24 with a van, a storage unit, and money I'd saved working double shifts at a hotel for 2 years. I source vintage and antique items, furniture, art, lighting, objects, and sell them to design professionals and private collectors. I started small. I learned fast. I made mistakes, fixed them, and kept going. By the time my dad called it a garage sale, I was running a real operation. But he'd never asked about the numbers. He'd never asked how I found clients or managed inventory or negotiated with estate sale companies. He didn't ask because he'd already decided what it was. And once Richard Elliot decides something, that's the story. If you're new here, welcome. Please do me a favor and hit like and subscribe before we go any further, because this story is one of those ones where you need to stay all the way to the end. I promise you, it pays off. Back to Easter. After dinner, while my aunt and uncle were helping clear the table, my dad pulled me aside in the hallway. I thought maybe he was going to walk it back a little, maybe acknowledge that the garage sale comment had landed wrong. Instead, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You know, I'm just being honest with you, right? I don't want you to wake up at 35 and realize you wasted your prime years on something that was never going to scale." I looked at him for a second. "I know, Dad," I said. He nodded, satisfied, gave my shoulder a squeeze, walked back to the living room. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, and something settled in me. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and more deliberate than anger. I took out my phone and opened my notes app. I typed one line, find out everything about his finances. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with the information. I just knew it was time to start looking, because something had been nagging at me for months. Small things that didn't quite add up. My dad mentioning offhand that he'd restructured some things. A comment from my uncle at Thanksgiving about dad needing to get his situation sorted. The way my dad had reacted when I'd casually mentioned property values in Deerfield were up 15%. He'd changed the subject so fast it was almost like a reflex. I filed all of it away, and I smiled through the rest of Easter dinner. I helped with the dishes. I hugged my dad goodbye. I drove home with my windows down, even though it was only 50 degrees out, because I needed the cold air to keep my head clear. Something was going on with Richard Elliot and his beautiful house in Deerfield, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. I want to be clear that what I did next was not impulsive. I am not an impulsive person. I spent 2 weeks just thinking before I did anything at all. I thought about whether I was being petty. I thought about whether this was some unhealthy obsession with a man who had always made me feel like I wasn't quite enough. I genuinely sat with that question because I didn't want to do something damaging just to prove a point. But here's what kept bringing me back. It wasn't about proving a point. It was the feeling that had been living underneath my skin for months. This low, persistent hum that said something is wrong, and you already know it, you just haven't looked yet. So I looked. Public records are more accessible than most people realize. Cook County property records are online. Lickin' filings are public. Court records for civil judgments are searchable. I'm not a lawyer, and I didn't have any special access. I just had time, patience, and a very specific last name to search. What I found on the first afternoon of looking made me sit back in my chair and stare at my ceiling for a solid 5 minutes. My dad had 2 liens on the Deerfield house. A lien is essentially a legal claim against a property. It means someone is owed money, and that debt is attached to the property itself. One lien was from a contractor, $11,000. Filed 18 months prior. The second was from a private lending company, $43,000. $54,000 in liens. On the house he called his crowning achievement. I kept digging. The private lending company, I'll call them Vantage Capital because that's close enough to their actual name, turned out to be what's sometimes called a hard money lender. They work with borrowers who can't get traditional financing. The rates are higher. The terms are stricter. And when someone defaults, they move fast. I searched Vantage Capital's public filings. They had filed a notice of default against my father's property 7 weeks before Easter Sunday. 7 weeks before, he sat across from me and called my business a garage sale. 7 weeks before, he told me he was just being honest because he didn't want me to waste my prime years. I closed my laptop and went for a walk. A long one. I walked for almost an hour through my neighborhood, and I didn't listen to anything. I just let myself process what I was sitting with. My dad was in serious financial trouble. The house, the one thing he had always held up as proof that he had built something real, was at risk. And he hadn't told anyone. Not me, not my brother Seth, not, as far as I could tell, a single person in our family. Instead, he was sitting at Easter dinner making jokes about garage sales. When I got home, I called my friend Dominique, who works in real estate finance. I told her what I found and asked her to help me understand what it meant in practical terms. She asked me a few questions, looked some things up while we were on the phone, and then she said something that stopped me cold. Cassie, if the default isn't cured and Vantage moves to foreclose, that debt goes to sale. Depending on the structure, a third party could buy it. I was quiet for a second. A third party, I said. Yeah. An individual, an investor, whoever. Sometimes lenders sell the debt before they even get to foreclosure if they want to recoup fast. It's not that uncommon with hard money lenders specifically. I thanked her and told her I'd explain more later. Then I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. I want you to understand that what started forming in my mind was not a revenge fantasy. I know how this sounds. I know the optics. What I was actually feeling was something closer to strategic clarity, like when you've been looking at a puzzle wrong for years, and then suddenly you tilt your head and everything snaps into focus. My dad had spent my entire adult life underestimating me. Quietly, consistently, with that smile that said, "You're sweet, but you're not serious." And the whole time, I had been building something real. Something that generated actual cash. Something with margins good enough that by the end of last year, I had a very healthy reserve sitting in accounts he didn't know existed. And here he was, the man who built a life, quietly drowning in debt he was too proud to mention. I started making calls the next morning. The first call was to a real estate attorney named Patricia Osei, who a colleague had recommended to me 6 months prior for an unrelated property question. I told her what I'd found. I asked her to explain the process if I wanted to explore purchasing the debt directly from the lender. She did not laugh. She did not tell me it was a cute idea. She said, "That's doable. Let me make some inquiries." I hung up the phone, and my hands were completely steady. Something had shifted. Something quiet and enormous. And I hadn't even told my dad a single thing. Patricia came back to me within a week. And what she found made the Lixon situation look like a warm-up. Vantage Capital was, in her words, highly motivated to exit the position. That's lawyer language for, they wanted their money and they were tired of waiting. The default had been sitting unresolved for nearly 2 months, and my father had, according to what Patricia was able to piece together from filings and a preliminary conversation with their rep, made no contact with them since the notice was issued. No contact. He had received a notice of default on his home, and he had simply gone quiet. That told me something I hadn't fully accepted yet. My dad wasn't just in financial trouble. He was frozen in it. He was doing the thing he had always done when reality became too inconvenient. He was ignoring it and hoping it would rearrange itself. Patricia also found a civil judgment I had missed in my initial search. A former business partner, my dad had done some independent consulting after his firm, had sued him for a breach of contract. Small amount by some standards, $18,000. But the judgment had been sitting unpaid for over a year and had accrued interest. So the full picture looked like this. A man with a 4-bedroom house in a good neighborhood, a house that was worth, at current market, somewhere between $610 and $640. Okaramsit, a man with $54,000 in liens, an $18,000 civil judgment, and a hard money lender who had already issued default and was actively looking to move on. And he was spending his Easter Sunday explaining to his daughter that selling antiques online wasn't a real business. I asked Patricia what it would take to purchase the Vantage debt directly. She walked me through it. It's a negotiation. The lender wants to get out clean, so sometimes they'll sell the note at a discount, meaning I wouldn't necessarily pay the full $43,000. I'd pay what Vantage agreed to accept, I'd receive the promissory note and all associated Linson rights, and I would then become the creditor. My dad would owe the debt to me. And the contractor lien? I asked. Separately negotiable, she said. I can reach out. Do it, I said. I need to pause here and tell you what was happening in my body during this process. Because it wasn't what you'd expect. I wasn't buzzing with adrenaline. I wasn't gleeful. What I was feeling was something much slower and more complicated. There was grief in it, honestly. Grief that it had come to this. Grief that my dad was a man who would rather drown quietly than admit to his daughter that he needed help. Grief that if he had ever, even once, looked at me like I was capable of something real, I would have offered that help freely, without any of this. But he hadn't. And here we were. I also want to be honest about something else. I called my brother Seth during this period. I didn't tell him everything. I just asked, carefully, whether Dad had said anything to him lately about money or the house. Seth was quiet for a moment and then said, "He asked me for a loan in February." My stomach dropped. "How much?" I asked. $10,000. I gave him $5 because that's all I had liquid. He said it was for house repairs. I asked Seth if Dad had paid him back. Another pause. No. I told Seth I loved him, and I'd explain everything soon. Then I sat with the knowledge that my dad had borrowed money from my brother, who was 25 and just starting out, and hadn't mentioned it to anyone. There was one more thing I needed to check before I moved forward. I needed to know whether my dad had any awareness of what was happening with Vantage, whether he was taking any steps I couldn't see from the outside. So I did something that felt strange. I called him. Just a regular call. "Hey Dad, how are you? How's the house? Anything new?" The kind of call I made every few weeks out of habit. He sounded fine. Cheerful even. Told me he'd been doing some work in the backyard. Mentioned he'd had lunch with an old colleague. At one point he said, "You know, spring is the best time of year in this neighborhood. Property values go up every year. This house was the best investment I ever made." I said, "Yeah, it's a beautiful house, Dad." He said, "You'll understand when you own property someday." I breathed very slowly through my nose. "Yeah," I said, "someday." We hung up. I texted Patricia, "Move forward." The negotiation took 6 weeks. Patricia handled everything. She was calm, methodical, and very good at her job. The kind of professional who makes you understand immediately why it matters to hire someone excellent. Vantage Capital agreed to sell the promissory note at a discount. I won't give you the exact numbers because some of it is still legally sensitive, but I will tell you I paid significantly less than the $43,000 face value. The contractor Leakin took another 2 weeks and a separate conversation, but that was resolved too. By the time everything was signed, I held both debts. In legal terms, I was now a secured creditor, with rights attached to 412 Harwood Drive, Deerfield, Illinois, my childhood home. Patricia filed the necessary paperwork. Everything was properly recorded. The chain of ownership on the debt was now clean and clear and entirely legal. And my dad had no idea. I want to be very precise about the timeline here, because people always ask. Between Easter Sunday, when he made the garage sale comment, and the day I finished signing the final documents, 4 months and 11 days, I did not rush it. I didn't act on emotion. Every single step was deliberate. Now came the part I had been sitting with for weeks. What to do with what I had. Because here's the thing. I could have simply held the debt and done nothing aggressive. Technically, I had options. I could have quietly approached my dad and said, "Hey, I know about Vantage. I bought the note. Let's talk about a real repayment plan." That would have been generous. That would have been the bigger person move. I thought about it seriously. I actually wrote out 2 columns on a piece of paper. What I gain from a private conversation. What I gain from letting it play out naturally. The private conversation column had things like, preserves the relationship, dad gets help without humiliation, might actually create something new between us. The other column had one thing in it. One sentence I had written and then stared at for a long time. He needs to understand what he dismissed, not to hurt him, not to destroy him, but because there was a version of this where my dad got quietly bailed out, learned nothing, and went right back to patting me on the head about my cute little hobby while privately cashing the favor. I had watched that dynamic my whole life. I had watched my mom extend grace after grace until she had nothing left to extend. I had watched Seth hand over $5,000 like it was nothing. No questions asked. No accountability. I was not going to be another soft landing. I decided to send a formal letter. Not a text, not a phone call, a letter, on paper, drafted by Patricia's office, informing Richard Elliot that his promissory note and associated live-in rights had been purchased by a third party, and directing him to contact the new creditor to discuss repayment terms, the new creditor being me. The letter went out on a Thursday. I know my dad. I know how he reads things, how he processes them. I gave him a full week before I called. I want to tell you about that week, because it was one of the strangest weeks of my life. I kept my routine completely normal. I went to my storage unit. I sourced a beautiful 1960s Italian chandelier from an estate sale in Evanston. I had 2 client calls. I took a long run on Saturday morning and listened to a podcast about supply chains. I did not call Seth. I did not tell anyone what was happening. I just waited. On day 5, my dad called me. I let it ring twice, the way you do when you want to seem like you were in the middle of something. Then I picked up. "Hi, Dad." There was a pause on his end. A long one for him. My dad is not a man who pauses. Cassie! His voice was different. Not angry, not yet. Something more careful. I got a letter. Okay, I said. It says my loan was sold. To a... He stopped. To a Harwood Elliot LLC. I had named the LLC after the street address. I know. Patricia had raised an eyebrow. I had smiled and said, "Do it." "Yeah," I said. Another pause. Is that you?" "It is," I said. The silence that followed was the longest I have ever heard from my father, Richard Elliot, who always had something to say, who always had a verdict ready, who had called my business a glorified garage sale in front of our whole family. Completely, utterly silent. He drove to Columbus 3 days later. Showed up at my door. I had expected that. I knew he wouldn't want to have this conversation on the phone, where he couldn't read my face, couldn't use the room, couldn't do the thing he always does where he makes himself physically larger and more present until you start to feel like maybe you're the one who's wrong. I made coffee. I set out 2 mugs. I sat at my kitchen table, and I waited. He sat down across from me, and for the first time in my memory, my father looked tired. Not angry, tired. Not frustrated, tired. Actually tired, like something he had been holding up for a long time had finally gotten too heavy. He started with, "I want to understand what you're trying to do here." I said, "I'm not trying to do anything, Dad. I bought a debt that was for sale. That's a normal financial transaction." "You bought my debt?" "Yes." He looked at his coffee. "How did you even know?" "Public records," I said. "It's all public." He was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly, almost to himself, "I thought I had more time to sort it out." And there it was. The real thing underneath all of it. He hadn't been ignoring the problem because he didn't care. He'd been ignoring it because he genuinely believed he could fix it quietly, invisibly, before anyone found out. Before it became a story about Richard Elliot who didn't manage his finances. Richard Elliot who needed help. The pride of it. The absolute iron pride of a man who had spent his whole life being the capable one, the one with answers, the one who knew things his children didn't. I felt something open up in my chest. Not triumphed. Something more complicated. "You borrowed money from Seth," I said. Not accusatory, just a fact on the table. He closed his eyes briefly. "I was going to pay him back." "I know you were," I said, and I actually believed that. "But he doesn't have it to spare, Dad. He's 25. "I know how old my son is." "I know you do." We sat there for a moment, both of us with our coffee, my kitchen quiet. Then my dad did something that cracked something open in me that I hadn't expected. He put his hands flat on the table, like he was steadying himself, and he said, "I owe you an apology. For a lot of things. But specifically for Easter. That was..." He stopped. Started again. "That was dismissive. And it wasn't right." I looked at my father. In 28 years, I could count on one hand the number of times Richard Elliot had apologized for anything. Not because he was a bad man, but because admitting fault required first admitting he was capable of it. And that was genuinely hard for him, in a way I don't think he could always help. "Thank you," I said. And I meant it. "What happens now?" he asked. Here's what I had decided. In those quiet days of waiting, I was not going to foreclose. I was not going to humiliate him or push him out of his house. That was never the point. The point was never to destroy him. What I offered him was a structured repayment plan, drafted by Patricia, with fair terms. Lower interest than Vantage had charged, a realistic monthly amount, a 10-year timeline, manageable, honest, no hidden conditions. But there was one non-negotiable I had added, and I slid the paper across the table and pointed to the clause. It said, essentially, that as part of the agreement, Richard Elliot would participate in 4 joint financial planning sessions with a certified advisor of my choosing, and that going forward, any major financial decisions involving the property would require 30 days, noticed to me as the Lincoln holder. He read it again. "You want to be involved in my finances," he said. "I want to make sure we don't end up back here," I said. "That's all." He looked at me for a long time. And then something happened in his face that I'd never seen before. It wasn't defeat exactly. It was more like recalibration. Like he was seeing me for the first time as the person I had actually become, not the 22-year-old with a storage unit who he had decided was dabbling. "When did you get so—" he started. "I've always been like this," I said quietly. "You just weren't paying attention." He signed the agreement that afternoon. Patricia filed everything the next morning. On the drive home from that meeting, I'd walked him to his car. It was awkward and tender and strange the way those moments are. He stopped at the door of his car and said, "Cassie, that chandelier you mentioned buying. Italian, you said?" "1960s, I said. "Murano glass. What'll you sell it for?" I told him. He let out a low whistle. Not a dismissive one. An impressed one. "That's a real business," he said. "Yeah, Dad," I said. "It is." He nodded. Got in his car. I watched him drive away. And then I stood in the parking lot of my apartment building, and I took a very long breath of spring air, and I let myself feel all of it. The grief, and the satisfaction, and the exhaustion, and the strange, unfinished tenderness of loving a parent who is a complicated person. I don't know what we are now. Something different than before. Something that might be better, slowly, over time. He texts more than he used to. He asked me last week what I thought of a repair quote he got for the back deck. First time he's ever asked my opinion on anything related to that house. Small things. But I noticed them. Here's what I know for sure. I built something real. I built it without anyone handing me a roadmap or a safety net or a single moment of, "I believe in you." I built it on early mornings and storage units and learning things nobody taught me. And when the moment came, it was the thing I had built that gave me options. That gave me leverage. That gave me the ability to help, on my terms, with my eyes open. The garage sale bought his debt. And then it saved his house. If this story hit something in you, please hit like. It genuinely helps more than you know. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, real ones, raw ones, the kind that stay with you. And leave me a comment. Have you ever had to prove yourself to someone who just refused to see you? I want to read every single one.